I graduated from college about 2 years before this happened. My best friend from those days was Alan. He was the adventurous type, always up for a hike or a spontaneous road trip. After graduation, he moved to a resort town in the mountains, scoring a job at a wilderness tour company. Not exactly putting his engineering degree to use, but it was a decision he made. Part of me envied him while I was sitting in my cubicle in the city. In the summer, I had planned to visit him for my vacation. Being the outdoorsy type, Alan was planning a camping trip for the two of us, and it was just what I needed. He was excited to show me around his new home, and he knew all the hidden gems, the kinds of places that weren't on any tourist map. Alan planned a 2-day camping trip in a spot that he said was a local secret. Apparently, it was a place known only among the longtime residents and avid hikers. When I got to his house, we stayed up talking for a while, but then we went to bed at 10 p.m. so we could get an early start in the morning. We loaded up the car with our gear, which was packed into 2 large backpacks. We went with a single tent that was supposed to be big enough for 3 people. Then there was a camping stove and some cookware. Other than that, it was just food, water, and clothes. We were planning to sleep right on the ground to save space. Since it was the summer, we could do that without freezing. Alan drove, while I kept an eye on the GPS on his phone. The way there was through a windy forest road that seemed to get little use. Every once in a while, there'd be a large branch or a log in the way that we would have to move or drive around carefully. Alan stopped the car at a seemingly random spot on the road and then turned off the engine. "This is it," he said. I didn't know where the trail was, but I followed his lead. We both got out of the car and took our bags from the back. By 3 p.m., we were on the trail and there was plenty of sunlight left. Not much happened on the first night. We set up camp as the sun was going down and managed to make a fire. In the morning, we tore down camp and kept hiking. It was late by the time we found our next site. It was hard in the dark, but we managed to make another fire. As time we stayed up a little later. It was around midnight, and the embers of our campfire were dying down. Alan and I fell asleep in our tent shortly after, but I woke up at about 2 a.m. and needed to step out to go to the bathroom. I unzipped the tent quietly, careful not to wake up my friend. I wandered a little way into the woods. It was dark and I didn't even have a light. The faint glow of the moon was barely enough to guide me. As I was finishing up, I noticed a light in the distance. It was a flashlight bobbing up and down, as if somebody was walking with it. I had to take a second look to make sure. I didn't know why somebody else would be out there in the middle of the night, in such a remote spot. Curious and slightly concerned, I decided to watch from where I stood, hidden behind the trees. The light kept moving, getting closer. Then I heard it, the faint sound of whispering. I couldn't make out what was being said, but it was definitely 2 or more people. I kept watching, and they seemed to be heading straight for our campsite. I thought about waking up Alan, but I didn't want to make any noise. The whispering grew louder, and the light was now close enough to illuminate parts of our campsite. I could see the silhouettes of 2 figures, moving cautiously, almost stealthily towards the tent. I watched helplessly as they walked up to it. My friend was inside, and I was worried. Acting on impulse, I picked up a rock and threw it in the direction of the intruders. It landed with a thud, may have hit one of them in the leg or the foot. The rock must have woken up Alan, because I could hear him moving in the tent. Then I yelled, "Alan, get the gun." We didn't bring a gun, but I didn't know what else to do. The figures turned their flashlight in my direction, but I was well hidden behind a tree and some bushes. They didn't stick around to investigate anymore. I heard the sound of footsteps as they ran off into the darkness. I rushed back to the tent to check on my friend. He grabbed his flashlight, and we both stepped out scanning the area, but we couldn't find anyone. We checked our belongings, but nothing seemed to be missing. Neither of us felt like sleeping after that. We got the fire going again, and stayed up for the rest of the night, talking about what happened. Alan was as baffled as I was. In all his time living there, he'd never encountered anything like that. The next morning, we packed up our campsite and hiked back. We called the police once we got back to town, but without any descriptions or evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I stayed a few more days with Alan, and the encounter in the woods was all we could talk about. We speculated about who those people might have been, and what they might have wanted, but we never got any answers. It's really crazy how lucky we were that I happened to be up when they came. Whatever they wanted to do to us, we would have been helpless otherwise. When I was a kid, around 12 years old, I went to a summer camp that was a few hours away from my city. It was my first year going, but one of my best friends, Josh, also went every year. There were a few other guys from my school who went too, but Josh was the only one who I was really friends with. When we got there, Josh told me about an old cabin in the woods nearby. He said it was abandoned and we should check it out. The idea sounded cool and a bit scary, but we decided to go for it. Josh told me that he and some other guys had explored it the prior year, but they got scared and left before seeing the whole thing. This year Josh wanted to explore everything that was there. We planned to go one night after everyone at camp had gone to sleep. We got some flashlights, put on our sneakers, and waited for the right time. When everything was quiet, we got out of our bunks and headed into the woods. Walking through the forest at night felt different. It was dark except for our flashlights, and every noise seemed louder. We kept walking looking for the cabin, but it was harder to find than we thought. Josh led the way because he had been there before, but it seemed like he didn't remember where it was. Finally, after what felt like a long time, we found it. The cabin was old, and it looked like no one had lived there in years. It was kind of exciting to find it, but also a bit creepy. First, we walked around the outside. It was an old log cabin, like something you'd see in an old book. It was in rough shape though. There was no glass in any of the windows, and the wood seemed badly decayed. There was a metal roof, but there were a few panels missing. The front door was also completely missing. We then went inside to look around. The place was dusty and filthy. We were just kids, so it felt like a big adventure. There were a few separate rooms, even though it was a small place. We were in the living room, but we could see the kitchen at the back, and there was a door that must have been for a bedroom. We walked around for a few minutes, covering both the living room and kitchen areas. But then, we heard a noise that sounded like it came from the bedroom. We both stopped and listened. It sounded just like a creak in the floor, but it didn't come from either of us. I was scared and wanted to leave, but Josh wanted to check it out. Not wanting to look like a coward, I covered up my fear. We inched towards the door. Josh turned the knob and pulled it open. When it was about a third of the way open, an arm popped out and slammed the door shut from inside. There was somebody in there. We were both really scared. We didn't know who it was or what he was doing there. Without thinking, we both turned around and ran as fast as we could back to camp. We didn't stop or look back, and we quickly got back to our bunks. We decided not to tell anyone because we didn't want to get in trouble for sneaking out. Looking back, I don't know if we were in any real danger. It seemed like whoever was in there just wanted to be left alone. It's still creepy to think that some homeless guy just moved into an old cabin right near a popular summer camp. It makes me wonder how he was surviving out there. If he was living there for any length of time, then he would have to get out for supplies and food at some point. Since there wasn't any kind of vehicle, I don't know how he was doing that, unless he was stealing from the camp. I walked past the cabin again during the day, but I didn't go in. Just as I was about to look away, I saw a figure move across the front window. It was just a shadow, but I was sure that I saw it. We never found out who he was. My dad used to take me on camping trips at least once per year when I was younger. My parents split up before I can remember. My dad lived in a small mountain town a few hours away. We would always do the easiest trails when I was younger, but when I grew up, I wanted to explore some more. Unfortunately, my dad had some health problems when I was in high school, so he couldn't go on overnight trips anymore. So whenever I would visit him, I would take a shorter trip by myself, usually just 2 nights. That way I would still have time for a visit. I decided to do a trail near my dad's house that we had often talked about exploring together. I remember feeling excited as I prepared for the trip, thinking about the times my dad and I had spent together on similar adventures. It was summer vacation between my 2nd and 3rd years of college, and I was spending the month of August with my dad. I had a summer job before that, but it finished at the beginning of the month. That left me with a whole month to visit family. I borrowed my dad's truck and headed to the trail by myself. When I arrived at the trailhead, I noticed just one other car parked there. This was one of the more remote trails in the area, so it was not the busiest. I parked the truck a few spots down from the car and unloaded my gear. There was no visitor center or anything like that. It was literally just a dirt parking lot with a sign at the trail's entrance. As I walked towards the path, I passed the car and noticed the back door was slightly open. That caught my attention, so I walked over to it. When I looked in the window, I saw a large camping bag inside, which led me to think that the owner had not started their hike yet. I wondered if they were around, maybe taking a last-minute break before hitting the trail. I looked around for a few seconds, but there was nobody there, just a forest and an empty road. I considered waiting to see if they would show up, but I decided against it. I figured it was none of my business, so I left it alone and started on the trail. After an hour of hiking, I didn't see another person, and I didn't notice any other footprints either. I was pretty sure I was the only one out there. Before dark, I found a good site and set up camp for the night. It was an established site that was easily big enough for 5 or 6 tents, but I was the only one there. As night fell, I cooked a simple meal and sat by my small campfire. I was alone, so there wasn't a whole lot to do. Because of that, I went to bed shortly after dusk. I lay awake for at least 2 hours listening to the sounds of the forest. In the morning, I woke to the sound of an engine, and it sounded close. That was strange, because it was a hiking trail with no vehicle access. When I peeked out of my tent, there was what looked like a park ranger walking towards me. I got out and went towards him. "Morning," he said. "Sorry to disturb you, but we've got a situation. There's a missing person in the area, and we're evacuating the trail for an investigation." His words took a moment to sink in. It instantly brought to mind the car I had seen at the trailhead, the one with the camping bag. He asked if I had seen anything, so I told him about the car. Other than that, I hadn't seen anything. The ranger nodded and jotted something down in his notebook. "We're asking everyone to pick up and head back. We need to keep the area clear for the search teams," he said. I turned around and headed back to my tent, and the ranger went back to his ATV. I quickly packed up my gear. As I walked back, I was nervous at first. I couldn't help but worry that there was some murderer lurking around there. However, after an hour on the trail, I saw another 2 rangers pass on ATVs. Because of that, I felt relatively safe. If there was anybody out there, then he surely would try to avoid the rangers. When I got back to the trailhead, there were several more vehicles there, police officers and more rangers. Some were studying maps, and others readying gear for the search. The car was still there, but it was blocked off by a police barricade. I spoke briefly with one of the officers, explaining that I hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. I left feeling helpless, wishing there was more I could do. In the days that followed, I kept an eye on the news, hoping for a positive update, but the person was never found. The mystery of what happened to them was big news in the community. There was a lot of speculation, but nobody knew for sure what happened. All we really know is that someone showed up at the trail and disappeared. From what I've heard, foul play was suspected. I think it's unlikely that the killer, or whatever, was out there with me, but it's possible. I continued to go on hiking trips, but never went alone again. Fortunately, my dad's health improved since then, and we go out together again. We only camp in car access areas though, which is fine with me. Me and my brother Leon went camping a few summers ago. We had always enjoyed the outdoors, but neither of us was particularly skilled. We both lived in the city, but we'd get out and do a camping trip once or twice per year. Nothing very remote, but definitely a step up from those campgrounds with car access and public washrooms. We chose a spot on public land, known for its beautiful scenery. We planned to spend 4 nights out there and stay in the same spot the whole time. It was meant to be more of a vacation than an adventure. On Thursday morning, I picked Leon up at his house. We packed up the car with all of our supplies that he had prepared, and then headed out. By 3 in the afternoon, we arrived at the parking area. It was about a 3-hour hike in, so we hit the trail as soon as we could. Just before dark, we found our first camp spot. It was a perfect clearing with a ready-made fire pit and some large logs set up around it for sitting. We set up the tent and then made a fire. The next day, We just hung around talking and cooked our dinner over the fire, and we spent the evening talking and stargazing. The second day started just as well. After breakfast, we realized that our firewood was running out. The area around our site was pretty picked over. It was slim picking when we showed up, but now there was basically no wood around. Leon decided to go and look for more firewood, while I stayed behind to tidy up our campsite. I wasn't worried when he left. Leon was fairly capable on the trails, and he was also very careful. I waited for a while, but eventually I started to get worried. Leon had been gone for over an hour, which was longer than I was expecting. He never said how long he would be gone for, but an hour seemed too long. I tried to brush off my concern, thinking that maybe he had just gone a bit farther to find good wood. But after another half hour passed, he still wasn't back. Something definitely wasn't right, so I grabbed our rifle. We always brought one for protection against wildlife, and I set out to find him. I followed the path we had used the day before, my eyes scanning for any sign of Leon. I saw which way he went initially, but I don't really have any tracking skills, so I was basically wandering around randomly. There were some footprints, but I didn't know if they were ours from before when we hiked in. About 20 minutes into my search, I came across fresh tire tracks. They must have belonged to a dirt bike or some kind of four-wheel vehicle. That was odd because neither of us had one, and we hadn't seen anybody else since we arrived. I followed the tracks, hoping they would lead me to Leon. After a half hour of walking, the tracks led me to a small clearing. Up ahead, I saw 3 men standing there, and Leon was sitting at the base of a tree. It was clear that he had been roughed up. His face was bruised, and he looked dazed. The men hadn't seen me yet, because I was hiding behind a tree and some bushes. While I waited there, I tried to decide what to do. There was no way to get help. My phone didn't work out there, and it would be hours, if not a day, before we could get help. We were outnumbered, and I didn't even know if they were armed. Not knowing what else to do, I fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare them off. I normally wouldn't do that, because you're not supposed to do warning shots, but in this case, I didn't have any other ideas. The 3 men jumped and looked around, then I yelled something like, "F off," and maybe threatened to shoot again. Before I knew it, the men were gone. I waited a minute or two before I came out. Then I rushed over to Leon. "Are you okay?" I asked, helping him to his feet. He was shaken, but managed to nod. "Yeah, I think so. They took me by surprise," he said. We knew our best option was to get out of there as fast as possible. We went back to the campsite and grabbed some essentials, water, a few scraps of food, and of course, our wallets and car keys. Then we started the trek back to the car. I was looking over my shoulder the whole way back. We were scared the men would come and get us. When we finally reached the car, it was a huge relief. We drove straight to the nearest ranger station. There was nobody there, but there was a phone number on one of the signs. We called them right away to report what happened to Leon. I talked to someone from the ranger's office, but as far as I know, they never found the man. As far as what their intentions were, Leon and I still can't completely explain it. The reality is that we didn't have anything really valuable. I don't think that most campers do. I guess our gear would have been worth around $1,000 brand new, but used, you would be looking at a few hundred. It's hard to see why they would attack my brother like they did. You may think he was trespassing on private land, but that's not the case either. We confirmed when we got home that the whole area was public land, so there was no reason for them to assault us. To this day, I can't explain it, but I think Leon would have been in serious trouble if I hadn't found him in time.